Thank you, and thank you for having me here. It's an honor to appear. It's also a little difficult. That is, it's a little difficult because I come from the United States, and the United States is a not pleasant place, especially right now. Americans like to think of themselves as being best, number one, and we are. We're number one in lots of things, like weapons and the sale of weapons, like incarceration, like the gap between rich and poor and the scale of that gap. There are 40 million people below the poverty line in the United States. We're number one as the rogue state in the world. We're number one not just in the manufacture of weapons of mass destruction, but in their use. We're number one in hypocrisy. We're number one in almost every bad thing you can think of. And I just want to let you know that if at times you go to bed at night and you think to yourself, God damn the United States, and you have some anger toward the United States, it's not the best possible politics, but I empathize with you. I go to bed that way at night too. Okay, so Occupy, first of all, it's called Occupy Wall Street. That's actually a bit of a misnomer. I just want to give so we're on the same page, what it is we're talking about. Occupy was not something that was basically on Wall Street. In fact, the most notable thing about Occupy in the United States, that it wasn't just in New York, it wasn't just in big cities, it was in smaller cities. It was even in small towns and villages. Not everyone in the country, but it did disperse in a manner that was very unusual for movements and has been unusual for movements for a long time. And what took many, many years in the 60s occurred very, very quickly in this movement. So one of its incredible virtues was its scope, its geographic spread over the country, and of course there were comparable activities, and in fact much larger activities in some places around the world. Its impact was substantial in the United States also. Not that it transformed society's basic institutions, not even that it won a lot of policies, but it did affect the discussion, it did affect the debate, it did impact what people were talking about all over the country, and in that way raise consciousness. There are also, however, when we look at ourselves, we need to learn to look at the problems as well as the things that we can sort of smile about, because there's no progress otherwise. And there are problems. So for instance, in calling itself the 99%, that was a nice slogan, but it never had anything to do with reality as far as the numbers of people involved. It was always a relatively small number of people. And that number dwindled. And we're going to come back to this, but a movement that is shrinking is a movement that cannot win. If we start with 12 million people before the war in Iraq, and a few years later we have hundreds of thousands, the most important question that the left faces is how can you possibly decline in numbers like that? Right? That is the question to answer, because whatever the reason is, one has to discern it and one has to act in ways that the opposite occurs. And the same thing can be said of Occupy, especially in the United States. Okay, so a first theme, a very important theme of Occupy, not universally, by any means. Occupy in the United States included people who were sort of libertarian, almost right-wing, people who were just getting aroused. But I think it's fair to say that the main Occupy organizers, and the best and most effective, we'll call them occupiers, call us occupiers, were people who rejected existing institutions in society, at least defining institutions. And how much did they reject, and why did they reject? They rejected existing institutions for a very simple reason. The perception that those institutions, by their very definition, by the way they function, by what they call forth from people, hurt people. That their natural operation was oppressive. It wasn't an aberration, it's built into those institutions. And therefore those institutions were the one that people felt needed change, needed to be replaced. And so I think the best occupiers rejected things like private ownership, the gargantuan accumulations of power and wealth in the hands of few people, market competition, the definition of cultural communities in a way that's exclusive and that denigrates racist and nationalist, the kinds of sexist and patriarchal hierarchies that we know exist. Okay, we all know about this. But nonetheless, the best occupiers did reject those kinds of institutions, and in that sense, even if they didn't know it, they were revolutionary. That's what revolution is. Revolution isn't waving a flag. Revolution isn't, violence. Revolution is, I want to replace the institutions that are at the core of society and that by their very logic oppress us with a different set of institutions which will have different attributes. And that was at the heart of, I think, the best of Occupy. And so one can have in the back of one's mind, but then why did it just keep growing? Another main virtue of Occupy was the understanding that we should want to create in the present that which we want in the future. We should want to plant the seeds of the future in the present. And Occupy had that as a key theme. Throughout the United States, in all of these endeavors, whether it was taking a town square, or whether it was taking a street, or whether it was then engaging in marches and activities, and in creating libraries for the people who were participating, and many other functions, Occupy had at its heart the idea that the values that we aspire to in the future, we should attempt to implement in the present. Why? Well, partly as a model, partly to show people that those values can in fact be acted upon, are viable, and are worthy. Partly to learn lessons. Maybe we've made a mistake about one or another thing. We can learn from the experience of doing it and therefore not make a mistake in the future. And partly because it can be fulfilling to the people who are involved. And that's not a small thing that we'll return to. What about seeking to win what we want, not just to embody the distant future, but seeking to win gains now? Here there's a very mixed record of Occupy. And it had to do with real differences, I think. So the notion here is, does one try to win higher wages? Does one try to end a war? Does one try to protect affirmative action? Does one try to win a shorter work week? Whatever list of things you want to mention. There are some who feel, and Occupy had many people who felt this, that such endeavors is just reforms. Phew, it's just a reform. It's not fundamental. It's just tinkering with the system. It's just requesting something of the system, and I don't want to be a party to that. I want to be about something entirely new. There were others who had a different view. Well, first of all, there were people who wanted those kinds of changes and wanted them as ends in themselves. I want to end the war and I'll go home. That's my goal. I want to get higher wages and I'll go home. That's my goal. I want affirmative action. I want to get rid of the death penalty in California. I want, and on and on and on. I want to prevent some house foreclosures and I'll go home. That approach, an approach which says that these gains are the purpose, are the aim, and if we succeed in getting them, we've succeeded, that's reformism. The reforms are the end. The first group didn't want to be reformist, rightly, I think. I don't either. But there's a big mistake in there, and it hurt Occupy a great deal, I think. And the big mistake is to mistake a reform for reformism. You can fight for reforms in a manner which is designed to create a trajectory of development, of increasing consciousness, and of greater strength so that you can win more, and so that it's a part of a process to win a new society. So you can fight for changes now that better people's lives now in a way that's non-reformist. And the very best of Occupy had that in mind. And so right now in the United States, when the very best Occupy people go out and try and fight against house foreclosures and keep people from losing their houses now, they do it in a manner where they talk about it and they organize about it, trying to create consciousness and strength to go on and fight for more, not to go home, as if it's the be-all and end-all. I'm emphasizing this because when we reject reform, it says to people, whether it's true or not, it appears to be true, that we're callous and that we're ignorant. Callous because we're rejecting that which can improve the quality of people's lives in the present. And if we don't care about that, there's something wrong with us. That hurts us. And ignorant because it is the process of fighting for gains that allows us to educate and to develop structures to win more and to keep going. I want to address some other problems that can be seen and that relate to this question of declining scale, of a movement existing, growing, getting energetic, getting exciting, but then beginning to devolve and to diminish in size. So one can be that it just decides that it's finished and it should go home. That's a reformist kind of dynamic. But there are others. I think we have a vision problem. We don't know how to answer Margaret Thatcher. When Thatcher says there is no alternative and we say yes there is, it doesn't convince anybody who believes there isn't. When Thatcher says there is no alternative and we say yes, but there's justice, yes, but there's liberty, even yes, but there's classlessness, yes, but there's dignity, it doesn't convince anybody. Why not? Bill Clinton says all that. He says it as well as we can say it, as emotively as we can say it, more eloquently we can say it. And we teach people and we say it doesn't mean anything because Bill Gates doesn't put forward a set of institutions which can deliver any of that. He doesn't really believe in any of that. And when we say those values, they're good values, but without institutions, without answering people's desire to see that it's really possible, we don't offset their cynicism. We don't offset their doubt. Right now in the United States, I would argue that the biggest obstacle to not just to having large movements, not just to winning major reforms that would improve people's lives, but to transforming our society, I think here, there, and around the world, is the belief that there is no alternative, and the belief that you cannot fight against state power. Those two things have to be addressed. So we have to apply ourselves not just to analyzing capitalism, but to providing a vision. A second problem is that programmatically, we worry about everybody except people in the movement. And people drift away from the movement because the movement doesn't fulfill them. And we need to, when we think about our movement program, when we think about our organizations and our structures and our activities, we need to think about them in terms of creating allegiance that lasts, creating commitment that lasts, which comes in part from people being fulfilled by what they're doing. Now, that's a second. And my last point is that I think deep down, at least in the United States, you can decide for yourselves whether this is true of Norway, but I'm going to tell you something that is true for the United States, I believe. We have an attitude problem. In the United States, there's a slogan. It's fight the good fight. Fight the good fight sort of means, you know, you're gonna fight against the heavyweight champion of the world and box him. You're gonna lose. You're gonna get smashed. But you do it eloquently. You look good while you're doing it. You fight the good fight, but you lose. That slogan is rampant in the American left. And the reason it's rampant is because most people honestly think we can't win. And if you think we can't win, your motivation to be serious strategically, to improve yourself so that you can do better, to build structures and to build organization that has continuity and that has coherence and that can continue to grow is very slight. You only have, you sort of have incentive to get along well with some people who are in your community and to be able to look at yourself in the mirror. But there's no incentive to try to win because you can't win. And what I would suggest is, while I said earlier that wanting a different set of institutions for a society makes one a revolutionary, it's true academically, it's true in theory, it's true abstractly. But if one doesn't honestly believe, if one can't conceive of the possibility of literally winning a new society, constructing in our societies a new set of institutions with new logic that fulfills people instead of crushing people, and one has to elaborate what that means, then it's impossible to be an effective organizer. People can feel that. People can see it. People can and they don't want to participate. So I think Occupy is trying to overcome these problems now in the United States. And I think that's incredibly important because it hasn't been going on for decades. And if those problems are overcome, then I think we'll see Occupy come back in a much larger scale and with much more effective activity, and it will continue on, and we'll see some real changes. Thank you.